And joining us now on the debate, Hussein Amarshi, president of Mongrel Media. Suds Sutherland, screenwriter and film director of Love, Sex, and Eating the Bones. Peter Howell, film critic with the Toronto Star. And of course, we welcome back Kate Taylor, the 2010 Atkinson Fellow and columnist at the Globe and Mail. Great to have everybody around the table for a good discussion about films and Canadian culture and what's up on the silver screen. I want to start by playing a clip. And this is a movie you've all seen. And well, I'll hold off comment for the moment. Michael, roll tape.
It's part of the game, it's part of the code. When someone challenges your manhood, you go toe to toe.
What does that have to do with hockey? I still don't understand. How do fisticuffs equate to being a man?
On the ice, I've always had your back. If they mess with you, they get a whack. If that don't help, then comprende. The knuckle sandwich comes into play. You see, I drop the gloves when it's required. That's the reason I was hired. I don't make fancy passes. I right wrongs by kicking asses. Without me, most would agree the game would devolve into anarchy.
Devolve, what does that mean?
Now, you've all seen that before, and you were laughing as you were seeing it again. Okay, Hussein, let me start with you. Your company has an affiliation with this movie. What is it?
We got involved at the beginning of the film when the idea was pitched to us, and then we distributed the film. So that means that we did the whole marketing campaign for it, decided when to open the film, how big to go, and either benefit from it or lose from it.
And how many screens was it on when it opened in Canada a few days ago?
It's still on 130 screens.
130 screens. Now, just relatively speaking, I didn't see this. I saw your movie. Loved your movie. I thought that was a great movie. Paranormal Activity 2.
Yes.
I did not see, but I gather it also opened this past weekend. How many screens would it have opened on?
I don't know for sure, but I suspect more than 200, but around in that range.
So more than yours?
Yes, indeed.
More than your movie?
Yes, indeed.
How did Score do in its opening weekend?
Less than what we were hoping for. Now, the thing is that this is unusual for a Canadian film to go out on so many screens. 130 screens in English Canada is a significant number of screens to get. And we had the best screens in the city, in the country, in fact. It was a gamble in the sense that the expectation was that a film of this nature, a hockey and a musical, to go out to all the small towns and the large cities without the Hollywood A-listers kind of a thing. So it was a risk, and we took that risk because we believe that the subject matter should appeal to a larger audience. What we're finding is that it is not the case. That it is a film that played tremendously well at the festivals. It was the opening night of 5 film festivals, including Toronto Film Festival.
Well, the buzz has been great. I mean, the commercials are everywhere. There's people talking about it.
Absolutely.
But it didn't translate into big box office.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, you're optimistic still. Kate, the comment I heard, I can't remember where I read this, was not tough enough for hockey fans, not gay enough for musical fans. What do you think of that?
Well, it's a very campy movie. I enjoyed it. The plot I found a bit sort of hackneyed. There's a kind of love story in it. But the notion of a hockey musical I found very amusing, and I liked the way the movie takes the problem at the core of our national myth, which this is a rather violent sport, and that's not very nice, and addresses that problem. So I thought that was very clever, but maybe there's a real marketing problem there that these two audiences don't overlap. It wasn't a problem for me with the film, but then I guess I'm more maybe on the musical side rather than the hockey side of things.
Peter, follow up on that. Why didn't this movie do better, do you think?
That's the $64,000 question. I mean, it's not West Side Story. I was watching the clip again there, and I was thinking that maybe if there had been slightly better rehearsals or something, or somebody like some more Broadway kind of involvement there. I mean, Men with Brooms did very well, and it was a similar kind of campy thing to it.
But it wasn't good. This is good.
Yeah, well, I remember it was funny, and this was funny. I was one of the few critics who actually liked this one, apparently, from what I gathered from people. I think it's what Kate was saying, or what you were saying as well, if you're a hockey fan, maybe you thought it was more of a musical, and if you're a musical fan, you thought it was more hockey, and somewhere they got lost in the middle.
Suds, what do you say?
Well, I think it's like, we can sort of eviscerate and sort of Monday morning, quarterback this, but the fact remains is that you release it in 127 cinemas, or 130 cinemas, and then it did whatever business it did. if the release was smaller and the same numbers were achieved, then it wouldn't be such a, it didn't work, or it didn't make a lot of money. Because the thing is that every film's got sort of its magic number, and the per screen average is something that we actually should be looking at as opposed to the overall gross figure. Also, like, one of the things that we're constantly getting, as filmmakers, and like, why aren't your films performing so well, or why aren't you doing, the thing is that—
Who do you get that from?
Well, you get it from the media. We get it from— I hear this conversation all the time. I've been having this conversation since I was in university.
Why aren't your films doing better?
Far, far too long ago. But this is a constant refrain. It's a constant conversation, and you see it in newspapers all the time. You hear it on the radio, and you watch it on TV. But the thing is that we need to look at, as you said in the earlier segment, Australia. Australia's a great sort of test case. They release around 25, films a year, 25 homegrown features a year, which is kind of like what we do. But also, when you look at them, they have a box office analysis that takes into account the release strategy. So if it's going to be something that's called a limited release, that's going to be like under 20 films. You've got something that's like more of a specialty release. That's going to be 20 up to 99.
Do we not take that into account here?
We don't take that into account. We're not doing the math, and we're not really making a real analysis. We're talking about this big, larger sort of, it's like the Indian men and the elephant. The blind men and the elephant, rather. They're each talking about some part of the elephant, not really understanding that this is actually the whole big picture.
I would disagree in the sense that we do have a whole range of strategies, and we have in fact released many Canadian films, including Away From Her or Water. I mean, Water, for instance, started on seven screens in Toronto and three screens in Vancouver.
So
on the opening week.
Next to nothing, in other words.
Exactly, 10 screens. Now, 10 screens is, again, it depends on the film, right? I mean, we are playing the Woody Allen film right now, and we opened the Woody Allen film on 2 screens in Toronto and 2 in Vancouver for the opening week. Now, we are expanding it on a week-to-week basis, and this week it'll be on 29 screens. But the fact is that every film has a different strategy. Now, in the case of the Score, a hockey musical, the idea was that here is a film that has the potential of reaching out to a large audience. Now, hockey is played in every part of this country. I mean, that defines us no matter what we become, but that is a defining aspect about Canada. And one would think that people would be curious about it. That was the idea, that there would be enough curiosity about the film that they would go out. Now, that's where we were wrong, in the sense that people may like to play hockey, but they're not necessarily interested in going to see a movie about hockey.
If you're in 130 screens on the opening weekend and it doesn't do well, how many screens are you going to be in on weekend 2 and weekend 3?
Weekend 2 will be on 80 screens, so we've lost about 50 screens, and we will
Your
be on
choice
80.
or the theater's choice?
It's a theater's choice. It always is a theater's choice, and it depends on what else is coming up. So it's not a question of like and if there were many other films coming out this weekend, we would have lost a lot more screens. So it all depends on what else is and where we sort of rank in the order of the cinema.
Now, Peter, Paranormal Activity
Yep.
was the #1 movie, I gather, this past weekend.
That's right. Unfortunately.
Yeah, like I didn't see it, and I shouldn't say anything bad about a movie I
If you
haven't
saw
seen.
the first one, you saw the second one.
It's the same thing.
Plus a baby.
Plus a baby. Okay. Paranormal Activity is a horror movie.
Yep.
Period, full stop, end of sentence. I know what I'm going to get when I go. Does the clarity of its brand, is that part of why it did so well, as opposed to this movie, which, is it a musical, is it a hockey story, is it a love story, is it,
Well, yeah, absolutely, you're right. It's a brand now. After just one film, it's a brand. It's a very effective brand too. And I think also too, there's the definite escape value it offered. I mean, there's the very strong and I think correct assumption that in times of economic crisis, you just want to be scared by something beyond reality, that you can kind of cope with that better than reality, which is even more frightening. So I mean, the Score wasn't scaring anybody. People also like to be amused, but apparently Score didn't amuse enough people.
Really? You didn't find it? Did you find it funny?
Yeah,
Score?
I found it funny.
It's cute, isn't it?
I think part of what we're talking about, though, is that kind of genre that people go to the movies looking for a very comfortable package, and of course Hollywood produces very clearly within those genre, and it's difficult for Canadian film without the budgets to create, an action thriller or get the stars for a big romantic comedy. It's difficult to find the niches that work.
Hussein?
One reality that we have to deal with in Canada is that when you're releasing a Canadian film, and it's only opening in Canada, the media that we can get is only the Canadian media.
Right.
The reality is that most Canadians get I would imagine 80 to 90% of their news about entertainment from American sources. Be
So
they
then-
magazines, be they television programs, be whatever it is. It is, if the film is opening in the US, Paranormal Activity, I'm sure that they spend about 20 to $30 million, if not more, to market that film.
And the guests are on Letterman and Leno
Exactly,
and all of that.
exactly. When you don't have that, and and there's always this debate that we don't have a star system, that we need to create a star system, but the star system cannot be created out of in a vacuum. The fact is that it is based on a whole industry, on a media, entertainment shows, magazines, like at the counters, whatever it is, at checkout counters.
It was on about 2,000 screens as well. I mean, Paranormal, when you talk about North
North
America.
America.
Whereas when you're talking about Score earlier, that's 130 screens in Canada.
In English Canada.
Yeah, in English Canada.
Exactly.
Well, we always
6 in Quebec.
6
but
in
yeah,
Quebec.
but only in English.
We're always comparing ourselves to a very mature and hegemonic industry that is the world over. It dominates the world. Now, this industry took 100 years to develop. Our industry is basically a teenager. So I think we're always comparing, like, apples, and people want to say apples to oranges, but I think for me it's like apples to apple pies, because we're talking about something, and you've got to pay the same amount of money. In the theater, you're making a decision. It's an economic decision. You're going to the theater, you're going to buy an apple, or you're going to buy this apple pie. What are you going to buy? And you're asking people to buy it for the same price.
Okay, but Suds, I'm always astonished at the lineups I see for American movies that are complete and utter dreck, and we know they're utter dreck before we even go to them. Right. And I'll plead guilty to this as well. My kids drag me off to some of these movies that I know are going to be dreck, but I know they want to see them. But here's a movie that really I thought succeeded at every level, and we're not going to see lineups for it.
I actually have a theory about this if you want to know what it is.
Sure.
I mean, people have a certain amount of money they're willing to spend on movies. And they say, okay, I'm going to go see The Social Network, I'm going to go see Paranormal Activity, and my third choice might be Score. But then what happens is their best intentions come into play, and they say, I don't have enough money left over. I would have gone to see Score. And I do think a lot of people think this way. And instead they go watch TV, or they just save the money, whatever. But I think Canadian films are always the second or third or fourth choice. It's not that we don't want to see them so much, it's just that they're way down the pecking order, and then the pecking order never reaches where it's supposed to be.
But there's a critical mass here. That, like, okay, for example, when we released our film, Love, Sex, and Eating the Bones, a long time ago.
Explain that title.
Love, Sex, and Eating the Bones. The idea is sucking the marrow out of life. This was a film about a brother who was addicted to porn. He meets a celibate girl, and then he discovered that he can't get it up without the aid of porn. So it was ahead of its time. So at any rate.
Interesting premise.
So this is before the internet pornification of the world. So what happened was we released it at 5 cinemas in Canada, in Toronto first. And so in one particular cinema, which is one of the most competitive cinemas in North America, we were there for 5 weeks. We were there at number 5 out of 13 cinemas. We had sellout shows. We had a very interesting way to promote the thing. So it became this sort of a local event. But what we failed to do was expand that beyond that market. After we had sellout shows, and when you have like a full audience in the theater watching the show and they're laughing, then that translates to, oh, you got to see this movie, and word of mouth spreads and so on and so forth. When you're seeing a comedy with like 4 people in the audience, it's not the same experience.
No, for sure.
We need to have like this kind of critical mass build, and then we expand.
But I get a sense here that we're kind of making excuses, that those kind of, if we compare ourselves to Australia, the Australians do a better job than we do of creating movies that are about Australia, that are set in Australia, and yet speak to sort of the general population, the person who's going to go and make it their number 2 movie on the weekend.
They're also not a 1-hour drive from 300 million people, so to speak.
Yeah, but that said, all the Hollywood product goes to them too. I mean, it's not like TV where, the airway, you share the airwaves. I mean, the Hollywood product goes there too, and yet there's that stronger sense of it being a cinema that succeeds in creating icons that resonate locally.
Do you know what they're doing because you were just there, right, a few months ago? What are they doing that we're not doing?
There's a sense there of, this comes really down to the actual cultural product itself, not marketing, not that they have a real talent for speaking about themselves without any pretension. And I think one thing that's interesting about Score, and also Gunless, which is the other example this year of an attempt at a populist Canadian movie with Paul Gross playing this American gunslinger.
Too populist.
Yeah, who comes into a town in the Okanagan where they don't know anything about guns because they're Canadian. So I thought it was funny. I thought it was kind of clever idea of trying to talk about gun control in that context. But clearly, the critics thought it was far too self-consciously Canadian. That it was kind of, here, folks, here's a Canadian story for you. And somehow the Australians don't seem to have quite that self-consciousness about it, and that seems to be their that's part of the forte of those films we all know and love, like Muriel's Wedding and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert.
But I don't know how many years, but Gallipoli. I mean, that's got to be 30, 40 years ago already, isn't it, almost?
25 years ago.
25 years
the
ago?
80s, early 80s, yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, for a couple of decades, the Aussies have been making better movies, I guess, than us, or more successful movies, or they've had a better sense of
they're not necessarily better, but something Kate said earlier, I think it's about self-identity and self-respect. I think the Australians have a stronger sense of themselves than maybe we do as Canadians. And I so often talk to people who are almost embarrassed to admit they like Canadian films. And I've had people suggest that if I like Canadian films, that somehow I'm soft. That I should be tougher. But I've always said that I think the best respect you can show a Canadian film is to treat it the same as any film anywhere else.
Sure.
Like not to give it special consideration, which I don't. I try very hard not to give it any special because of win one for the home team or something, right? But I do think there's an identity thing there.
Tell me, just in terms of our better understanding the movie business here, if a movie doesn't do well on 900 screens in the United States when they open it up and it doesn't meet expectations, they've got 25 tricks in their back pocket in a way that will help them at the end of the day make a profit. Do you have those same avenues open to you?
It's not, I mean, every weekend when maybe 5 or 7 films opened, half of them, if not more, fail. So that happens every week. The fact is that 80% of the films don't perform at the box office, be that in Hollywood, Bollywood, Nollywood, wherever.
80%?
80% of the films do fail to meet the expectations.
Fail as in lose money?
Yep. Theatrically, yes.
Huh.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at it every week. I mean, there's a Paranormal Activity, but that was #1 film. Everything else under that was not performing.
So how will you attempt to make money off of Score if you don't make it in theaters for first run?
Well, in a Canadian context, we have a few things that help us. The first factor is that Telefilm Canada does help us with the marketing funds on Canadian films. So that protects us somewhat from the losses that one could have had without that kind of protection. Secondly, we do have, thanks to CanCon regulations, we do have TV sales on this film. So it will be shown on TMN, Movie Central, and CBC in the next few years.
And you can make decent money doing that?
We will make enough money to possibly reduce our losses considerably.
So you're going to lose money on this?
We will lose some money, but not much.
Can you tell us how much?
I'm still trying to figure it out. I mean, we have this. I mean, we still have to figure out how it will do on DVD, and it could do quite well on DVD. We've had. I mean, Michael McGowan's last film was 1 week, which is a film that we picked up at Script Again, and we did extremely well with that. I mean, that was a film that again, just like Score, people had mixed feelings about it, and yet it ended up performing extremely well theatrically, but even better on DVD. I mean, it's still an evergreen title for us.
I'm just trying to get my head around the numbers. Like, for example. Score cost how much to make?
Score was over $5 million.
$5 million bucks. Okay, that's like the catering fee for most American movies,
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So
it's all relative.
for the first week. Okay, so $5 million bucks. So if you're going to lose money on this, are we talking 6 figures, 5 figures?
It'll be low 6 figures if it is.
Low
yes.
6 figures. Okay, so I'm just trying to figure it out here.
That's the nature of the business. So I don't have any problems with that aspect. I mean, every business, you do lose some and you win some. And at the end of the day, as long as you win more than not, then you're okay.
Well, I mean, I applaud Hussein for swinging for the fences. I mean, we need to do this more. We need to have more misses before we have more hits. I mean, this is not any kind of exact science, or else Hollywood, every film that comes out of Hollywood would be a hit. This is alchemy. This is, this is a lucky strike.
I should ask the journalist this, because I'm one of those guys who actually sits and watches the movie right to the end, all through the credits.
Wow.
And I force my kids to as well. And I tell them.
Waiting for the little trick at the end.
And I know, because I want them. Well, there's sometimes a trick ending, and sometimes I always say to them, look how many people it takes to make a movie. It's unbelievable how many people it takes to make a movie. They should know what goes into it. The first, it felt like 10 minutes, but it probably was only about 2 minutes of credits after Score is every government in the world who gave a tax credit, a contribution, a something or other, Now, is it a...
That's really standard. Earlier, in the earlier segment, I said that the United States was the only country in the world that did not subsidize its cinema. That, of course, was incorrect. It's the only Western country in the world that doesn't subsidize its cinema. Bollywood, of course, is a purely commercial cinema. But most countries, Britain, France, Spain, Italy, give money to their filmmakers because filmmakers can't make movies that can compete against Hollywood without at least loans. I mean, the idea of the telefilm money is that they'll be successful and pay it back. The reality is most of the time they don't, because as Hussein's described, it's a hit-driven industry. So your big hits carry the rest, right? But because in a Canadian market you don't have those big box office hits, it's not really a commercial market.
I wonder, I could be totally wrong on this, Peter, you tell me, but I wondered whether or not people might think there are 20 government partners. I'm taking a guess here. It looked like a lot. 20 government partners in the making of this movie. I mean, is this really a movie, or is it somebody's tax shelter, you know, ...
I think you're the rare animal that stays to the end of the credits when that part comes up.
You didn't have to stay to the end. It was at the beginning.
I think if you pointed that out to people, they may raise an eyebrow. But you know, in France, for example, there's a filmmaker named Olivier Assayas who you're distributing. His last movie, Summer Hours, the Musée d'Orsay helped pay for it, like a museum actually. The museum where they have Whistler's mother actually kicked in some money for this film, right? So they have very interesting financing in Europe, and I don't think people get as excited about it as maybe we do here. And I know we seem to be heading into a new era where all things government are bad and all things public are bad, but I don't, at this point, sense a big problem with people going to see Canadian movies on the basis of who funds them.
Okay, let me read this. Sorry, forgive me, I'm getting behind here because I'm too interested in the mechanics of Hussein's company. Okay, this is from a piece written 10 years ago, still apropos for today, called Facing Up to Hollywood. I'm not going to tell you who wrote it yet. I'm just going to read you an excerpt from it. The extreme globalization of film production has made the idea of national cinemas more problematic than ever before. Alongside the eternal desire to use the medium to address national history and cultural values, all producers of national cinemas are also aware that much greater profits and prestige are to be found in a reconfigured international film market now driven by global tastes. Now, Canada, right? Well, actually, no. Not written about a Canadian film industry. This was written by Ana Lopez about her native Mexico. These problems are not unique to us. Are we at a point where discussion of a national cinema no longer makes sense?
I don't sit down and write and think, okay, I'm going to make a national cinematic film right now. And I don't think anybody goes into that if they're making a poem or if they're making a play. I don't think that's how you start. You start at wanting to tell a story. Where I think that where we don't really sort of perform, we don't sort of choose genre. Like I think Canadian filmmakers, we don't even really approach genre. We talked about a horror film doing very well this weekend. We don't do a lot of horror films. We do a lot of sort of in-between genre films. And I think that when people are making an economic choice, they're looking for a sure bet. They're looking for something that they've heard about. I go to a lot of theaters and I ask people how they make their choices. And all this is all very anecdotal. How most people make their choices are, A, have I heard about it? Has somebody who I trust, told me about it? And sometimes they're asking the ushers. They're asking, who's in it? Is it any good? They're looking for somebody to give them a positive word of mouth. If we can't generate positive word of mouth, then, where are we?
What do you think of
this?
this?
That argument is a really dangerous one because if you say, okay, well, there's kind of this international market now, there's this sort of accepted genre, and we'll go with that, we don't have those budgets, so you risk creating bad copies of American genre films. And I think the things that ultimately do break out are the things that speak to their own place and that say, well, this is quirky, this is different, this is from a place you wouldn't expect. And sometimes those films actually wind up doing well internationally, and that's sort of what Hussein distributes, and that's what you specialize in, is those ones that kind of will break out and say, well, sure, this is set in India, or this is set in Mexico, or this is set in Canada. It's not set in LA, where most stuff comes from, but you might be interested in this, you person who lives in some other place.
And the reality, we have had success with a film like Away From Her, which was a very domestic film. It is set in Ontario, and it is a Canadian writer and Canadian director. Most of the actors were Canadians, and it became not this, well, one of the stars, you know, I mean, Gordon Pinsett is still a star.
Yeah, sorry,
but,
forgive me, but not Julie Christie.
Exactly. But the fact is that that film traveled all over the world. It was a significant success in many territories. Same with Water. Again, Water was a Canadian film, except for the fact that it was not set in Canada. Now, we do also have another genre, that is the Trailer Park Boys, and the Foo Bars, and we've had tremendous success with that kind of, that aspect of Canadiana.
Meatballs.
Meatballs.
But these are comedies, and again, like they're filling an expectation. Like the expectations make. You need to set up the joke, you need to pay it off, and then people laugh. And it's very clear. People are making a choice based on
Canadian, though. That's
they're uniquely, and that's great.
And
that's they work in Canada. You know, I go to see these films and I laugh and I enjoy it. Meatballs, for example, performed very well in America. You know, but that was like all of its money. It like made something around $43 million back in the day, which was huge, and that made Bill Murray's career. But what I'm trying to say is that we need to do more films, period, and we need to make genre films as well as the quirky films, because it's only by doing more films we'll have a chance to get these quote hits.
That's what Quebec has done.
And that's what Quebec has done.
Quebec has been very successful. Well, they have the built-in cultural identity, which I think is essential, but also they do all kinds of genre. They were doing horror films like 20 years ago when they weren't quite the rave they are now. Like they've had amazing success with their local, their cultural films.
Should be noted, though, Quebec films don't do that well internationally. They tend to be very much appealing to a regional sensibility. In those comedies we're talking about, the Trailer Park Boys and stuff,
There's one coming up, Denis Villeneuve's Incendie, that won a prize at TIFF. I think that's going to do very well this year. I think that's going to be a Quebec film that really goes well.
But Quebecers support their homegrown filmmakers,
they sure do.
don't they?
They sure do. And you get, I mean, there's this point where you just need to kind of, become a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle. That Canadian film needs to be a winning brand the way Canadian literature is a winning brand. And then you say, oh, hey, we're going to a Canadian movie. Aren't we clever and smart? And Quebec, there is that sense of, hey, what's this weekend's film? And that it'll be a local film.
Okay, but again, as I try to figure out how this industry works or doesn't, there was a time when many people thought if only the cinemas in Canada were to be in Canadian hands instead of American hands, all of our problems would be solved. They'd be able to carve out enough screens, enough ice time for all of our movies, and therefore we wouldn't have to, right? But that's the case now. And yet we still don't.
And that speaks to the fact that we got 130 screens. I mean, we got all the screens more screens than we wanted. And it's a Monday call, and on a Monday, yeah, exactly. So the screen time is not a problem at all. I mean, that was the idea. That, again, I mean, it's the same thing that if you have a star system, we will, that'll be the magic sort of bullet that will solve all the issues. I don't think that it is what we're doing is not. It has to be seen in the context of where we are. We are making films that speak to us. Not all of them do speak to us, and the fact is that the failure rate is no more or less than any other industry, really, any other cultural industry or any other sort of film industry anywhere in the world. Yes, it's true that Australia does better and has done better, but the fact is that there was a time when Australian films used to travel more abroad. Now they don't. Often. The only film that has traveled recently has been Mao's Last Dancer, which is a film that we distribute in Canada, and it had a lot of American stars. It's set in America, and it's so they also struggle. But the fact is that we are making films that do work. I mean, it's not it's in relative context, right?
Can I just ask the question? You were saying the telephone gives money for marketing, right? But does it help pay for trailers? Because I remember somebody once told me that one of the problems we have in Canada is that we can't compete with the American trailers. You can have a really bad the trailers for a movie. Yeah, there'll be a really bad American movie, but you'll see it every 10 minutes on a TV show, and it makes people want to go see it. And the problem with Canadian films can't afford that kind of saturation.
It all depends. I mean, not every Canadian film deserves the kind of release that we did for Score, a hockey musical. I mean, there are films that we will open on 1 or 2 screens and that may build or may not build. But the fact is that when we have had a film like Score, a hockey musical, or Men with Brooms, or there have been several films that have had large releases, like large expense on marketing them.
Do you think Canadians see themselves reflected in Canadian films? Take Quebec out of the equation for a second. They clearly do.
Right.
Do Canadians in English Canadas, quote unquote, see themselves reflected in Canadian-made films?
Not always, but when they do, it's a very nice feeling. I mean, I think that On One Week, for instance, was a film that did appeal to people in a really deep way. And you could see that in the comments that we were getting, like on YouTube or on all kinds of websites that people were writing about it.
How much money did it make?
$1.3 million in box office, but it has done tremendously well on
good?
DVD.
I don't know. Is that good?
That was probably the second highest grossing film, English Canadian film last year.
is great.
Yeah.
5 million is great. So
but 5 million is Passchendaele. That's been the highest that we've had in over 15 years.
Yeah.
So, I mean, over $1 million is always good. Now, again, to give you a context, Rachel Getting Married, a film that had, stars, and it was a big American film, got a couple of Oscar nominations. We did $1.4 million of box office in Canada. And Education, a film that we distributed last year, 5 Oscar nominations, 1.3 million box office. So relative to films at the same level, a 1 week is a big success. Relative to Titanic or to Avatar, it's a loose change.
And if you look at the Australian example, it's the same thing. The release strategy and the ad spend and the amounts of prints, and the Canadian films compare favorably. The Australian films compare a little bit better. And the thing is that we're all looking for these outliers, for these hits. And the fact of the matter is, we're not going to generate a lot of money from these films if we're only releasing them on 2 screens. And so, but if you're going to release more of them, then you'll get more money. I mean, that's like the equation is very clear.
But let me follow up with you on the question I asked Hussein, which is this idea of whether or not we actually see ourselves reflected on there. Are we are we so multicultural a country that blacks only want to go see movies about blacks? Jews want to see movies about Jews, Arabs want to see movies about Arabs.
And
French people want to see...
Blue people only want to see movies about blue people?
Well, I'm asking...
We have no blue people here, but everybody wants to see Avatar. I disagree.
That's not part of it.
I think in terms of the literature, I think in terms of the music we listen to, I don't think that multiculturalism is holding us back. What I think is that somewhere there's a distance between the films and the audiences, and we need to bridge that gap. Because we've got some amazing filmmakers here, we've got some amazing actors here, talent is everywhere, but we're just not getting them in front of the people who want to see it. Because you look at the festivals, and these people are rabid, they're lining up and so on and so forth, and we've got great festival coverage in this country. And again, as you say, 1 week was in festivals across the country. It made a sizable, impact. And then again, Michael McGowan's Score opened 5 festivals in the country. There was huge buzz on this film.
Yeah.
And again, the question was 130 cinemas too much? That was the question.
You follow up if you would, because you said blue people. There are not enough blue people to make Avatar number 1.
What you just said about how Jewish people going to Jewish movies and gay people, I know there's some people who say that, and I've encountered that argument occasionally, which bothers me because I don't believe it's true. But
Peter,
I think
you've been to a Woody Allen movie, Peter?
I've been, way too many of them.
Okay, so you don't think there's a few Jews who go to Woody Allen movies or Mel Brooks movies?
Oh yeah, definitely there are. But I mean, I think people go to see good movies that appeal to them in some way, and I think if you have that built-in, if you are culturally inclined that way, yes. For example, I like the first Sex and the City movie. Hated the second one. It's not because I'm male or female. I mean, but there was this. I hate the term chick flick. I never use it. I think it's a very demeaning term. But I see even very intelligent women using chick flick to describe movies that I don't think necessarily are that way.
But I'm going to follow up. Do you know who goes to see your movie? You've got the Woody Allen movie, right?
I agree that you do have to anchor your films, and you do need to find what that anchor is. One of the very first Canadian films that we distributed was Bollywood Hollywood. And Bollywood Hollywood was an idea that Deepa at a lunch said, I've got this idea, I want to sort of do this film. And I said, fine, let's do it. I mean, having no idea how to market a Canadian film at that point. But what we did know, and what I knew, was that it could be anchored in the South Asian community. So at least I could depend on that
this
base.
is what I'm getting at.
Exactly.
You did not open this movie in Melville, Saskatchewan, right?
No, we didn't.
You did it somewhere in the GTA.
We did.
I'm not saying they wouldn't like it there. I'm just saying
of course, there's
a connection.
We did quite a few cities, but the fact is the highest number came out of Mississauga. And certainly, you see it on a Friday and say, wow, this is a big number. And that was because the people in Mississauga, the South Asian community, went out. Now, we also were able to market that film to that audience in a very different way than we marketed for the general audience. And the fact is, at the end of the day, we had, I would say, probably about 60 to 70% audience would have been non-South Asian, but the South Asians did anchor that film in certain areas.
That's the only point I'm trying to make. And you gave me a tisk. I heard that. You gave me a tisk there.
You know what the Americans do, though, that's very smart, though? They'll cut several trailers to appeal to different groups. Like for a
Yeah.
big movie, they'll cut it for the male audience and they'll show it during a football game, and then they'll cut it and they'll show it during The View,
That is
like a
clever.
more
And,
female.
and we've done that also. But the fact is that that is the case everywhere. I mean, Tyler Perry, I mean, you probably don't, I mean, most people don't even know his name, but the fact is that he makes
Okay,
films.
who is
Tyler Perry is a black filmmaker out of the US. His films appeal primarily or only to black audiences. It does $40–50 million on a film.
Oh yeah, 60 Minutes did a piece on him a few
Yeah,
weeks
I
ago.
mean,
Yeah.
every couple years or every year,
Specific
basically.
market.
And it is, he's got an amazing market, and he doesn't care about anybody else. And so there is, I mean, like, of course, we have to identify what our interests are, and some of it is identity-based, some of it is interest-based.
Okay, so you want to take your tisk back and then tell
no.
me, okay.
I'll explain the origins of my tisk. Was simply that, okay, so part of what you're talking about is ethnic marketing and doing movies that appeal to one's very specific community. But when we talk about multiculturalism in Canada, I think we're talking about something a little more than ghettoized separate community. I do think we're talking about a pride in a cultural dialogue, cross-cultural, not just one culture to itself, but cross-cultural. And I saw Hollywood Bollywood. I really enjoyed it, and part of I think what I enjoyed about it was that sense that it was talking to me about something about Canada that I like, but maybe don't know that much about.
Okay.
And I would say that we haven't mined that. I mean, the whole multicultural aspect about the diversity, the pluralism of the country has not been mined to the extent that it can, and it probably will happen. It's just a question of time, I would think.
Okay. How am I doing on time? I've got 2.5 minutes left or so? 2.5. Okay. Kate, you wrote this. A movie has an importance that a watch or a coffee pot does not. Is there not some weakness, some heartache, some fatal invisibility in always watching ones that take place in a foreign country? Does this not matter? Okay, after our conversation, still think it matters as much as you did?
Yes, I do.
You do. How come?
Because it's about stories and it's about storytelling, and I just can't believe that we want to live in a world in which there's only one dream factory. There's only one group of people who get to tell stories, and that's Hollywood. Everyone else can just shut down, not tell stories. I just don't believe that. And films happen to be the most powerful and the most prestigious form of storytelling in the contemporary world. They've achieved this particular place, and they have this iconic status, and so I think it's important we produce some films here, and some films that are popular films.
Peter, what do you say?
I agree. I mean, there was a time when Canada had a very vigorous and active film community. We do now, but I mean, in terms of the people going to see the Sergeant York movies and things like that, pre-World War II, somewhere along the line, Hollywood took over. I mean, it became the predominant force in culture. But I would hate to think that Canadians only wanted to make films that were in like in America. I'm always glad when somebody is brave enough to put the CN Tower in a Canadian film. It's almost like you're afraid to go there because you're saying that this was made in Toronto. But I always feel great when somebody does that.
Suds?
I don't think that the artists in this country are going to give up in any space and time. I think that we're going to continue, and we're going to, I guess, keep in search of this quote hit. But I think that we're just going to tell our stories, and I think that we should be emboldened by that. If we'd stop, I mean, what's there for our children?
Hussein.
I lived in Pakistan for about 10 years, and there was a time when NFB documentaries would show up on television in Pakistan, and that was how I had a sense about Canada. And to not have our stories, both for Canadians and for the world out at large, it will be a big mistake. I mean, this is how we tell about ourselves, to not ourselves only, but to the world.
Well, I can tell you, if you see Score, a hockey musical, you will see the CN Tower and the Sky Dome and Nathan Phillips Square and a whole lot of other stuff. It's a movie that unabashedly is set in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, to be sure, even though the home team's Brampton, I think, right?
Indeed.
Anyway, love the picture. Hope lots of people go see it. Thanks very much to Hussein Amarshi, the president of Homegrown Media, Sud Sutherland, the film director of Love, Sex, and Eating the Bones. Love that title. Peter Howell from the Toronto Star, and Kate Taylor, Globe and Mail, and the Atkinson Fellow for 2010. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your contribution to this discussion tonight.